The photograph lay on the back stairs, its edges curled like dried petals, the summer light staining it honey in the small dust that gathered there over the years. I picked it up with careful hands, not for the image itself, but for the hush it carried. The hush of a time when the world still seemed small, and the house knew your name before you did. There was a time when that house wore the days like a coat. It stood at the bend in the river road, a long, patient thing with a porch that moaned in the wind and windows that remembered more summers than we could name. My sister Mara and I spent our hours there the way sparrows spend a sunbeam, a trilling sort of joy that felt almost like breath. We believed the house loved us back in the way old things do, quietly, with small signs that someone was listening when we spoke in our loud, innocent voices. The photograph is of that summer, though it doesn't show us all. The porch, the lilac hedge behind the gate, the dusty blue dress Mara wore that day, and me, a boy taller than I deserved to be, smiling as if we had no shadows. On the back someone wrote a name in a careful looping script, Mara and me, summer of 52. As if the year itself might be archived by handwriting. But in the photo there is a shape I cannot explain, a faint figure near the railing, a girl half hidden behind the slats, eyes that do not belong to the summer light. The edges of the print tremble as if the moment remembered something it did not want to forget. The memory grows in the telling, as memory always does, with little tremors of detail that do not seem important until they carry the weight of a revelation. We called our ritual keeping watch, though I supposed it could have been called something more practical and less holy, something that would have made a clever neighbour laugh. It was a summer habit, born of a fear we did not yet know to name. On the longest day of the year, when the day stretched thin and the river glowed with a pale, tired gold, we set a plate at the far end of the kitchen table and poured a little water into a glass. Mara and I stood close to the door that led to the pantry, the air smelling faintly of cedar and soap, and Mother spoke softly of the house's memory, as if the wood remembered the day the kitchen floor was laid, and the nails still whispered their first prayers. Then we whispered too, the three of us, names in a hush I would later ache to utter aloud, the ones who had wandered away, the ones who might wander again, the ones who could vanish if we forgot to keep them in the room with us. The house listened in a way that felt almost sincere. A creak would sigh out of a floorboard, as though a tired old man had risen from slumber. The glass in the window rattled, with a breath that belonged to the pane, and no one else. The smallest sounds travelled through the walls, in a language I could not translate, but Mara and I understood their intention. Do not let the room forget you. Do not let the room forget anyone who ever knocked on its door and asked it to remember them. That summer, something offered us a glimpse of its meaning, a thing that did not belong to daylight or to the ordinary life of a child. One evening, when the red air had cooled to the colour of old pennies, a tapping began behind Mara's closet, a soft rhythm that did not come from any leg you could see, a patient tapping that could have belonged to a bird or a tiny creature seeking shelter. We pressed our ears to the wood and listened until the tapping took on a second life, a repeated syllable that sounded almost like a name. We looked at each other with a shared fear and a childish certainty that the house was not merely listening to us. It spoke back in its own way, through the hinges' squeal and the breath of the old timber. Mara's courage, if I am allowed to call it that, grew out of her stubborn tenderness. She told me once, very softly, that the house deserved to be fed with our attention, just as it had fed us with warmth in winters and the memory of summers. so we kept it fed, even as the air grew thick with something old and heavy, as if the walls themselves, not in the way a ship vanishes on the horizon when you think you are watching it, but as if the world had tilted slightly, and Mara had stepped through the seam of the doorway to another room that did not appear on any map. The day she went missing, the house wore a different expression, as though it had learned something it chose not to reveal to us. The pantry doors stood a moment too still. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with a cadence that did not match our breathing, and the window's reflection offered me a glimpse I would never be sure I understood. Mara's image, in the glass, but older than when I saw her last, older than the year on the photograph. My parents said she had run away to live with a cousin in a city where the rain fell like tongued glass. I could not speak to them of what I felt, which was a sense that the house had hidden her away, where light could not reach. I did not dare tell them the tapping behind the closet would resume at intervals, a patient, muffled knocking that sounded almost like a small apology. The house, I began to suspect, did not want Mara to leave. It wanted her to stay, to be kept in a room where time could be counted as if it were a thread, and where the thread never frayed. Years after, I learned not to ask questions aloud in that house. I learned to listen instead. I listened to floorboards in the attic that creaked in a rhythm not my own, and to the attic hatch that always stuck just a moment longer when I pressed it, as if the house waited to catch its breath after I left the room. I learned that a house can carry a memory not of a single person, but of every person who ever loved it enough to tell it their name. The story of Mara did not die with her. It settled into the wood, took root in the wallpaper. Learn to breathe with the furnace. Learn to speak in the lull between heartbeats. Decades passed, and the children of my sister's children learned to see the old place anew, as a place to visit rather than to live. But the photograph never moved from the back stairs, as if it were the only thing that would not forget the summer we pulled the thread from the world and started to stitch it into the house itself. When I would sit in the living room and run my finger along the shelf where the photo rested, I felt the years gather like a shawl around my shoulders and the river outside sigh with the weight of all the summers it had seen. I grew old, they say. My hair went white enough to read the years in the strands. My eyes grew more patient, more prone to listening than to judging. The house did not change, except in the most patient, telling ways. The staircase step you miscounted when you were a child now wore a different groove. The kitchen chair's paint peeled in a pattern that resembled, for a moment, a name you thought you forgot. It is a strange thing